Hi everyone, it's Matt from The Pen Habit. I'm glad to be back for another video, and this time we're going to go back and do another little ink review. And today's ink is an ink from J. Herbin. This is Bleu Pervenche. It's an ink that I've had for a long time, but I haven't used very much because I mentioned this earlier. I usually take a little label and color it with the ink and put it on the top of the box. And the color that it came out with just didn't interest me all that much. So I hadn't gone back to it. But turns out the color of the ink on that particular little label, not very accurate. So I've been missing the opportunity to use an ink I've actually started to like quite a bit. Now, generally speaking, J. Herbin inks tend to run a little on the dry side, and they tend to run a little on the unsaturated side. They're usually considered quite safe for most pens. They work pretty well in most cases, even on inexpensive paper, but I find them as an overall line a little on the uninteresting side. This ink, however, doesn't really fall into that same category as many of the other inks in their line that I've tried so far, and I admittedly have not tried a lot. So the ink comes in these little bottles. I have to say, I really dislike these bottles. They are exactly the wrong size for filling a fountain pen. If you're going to dip the pen, hey, it's great. But for filling a fountain pen, they're short, wide, and squat, which if you've got a pen with a large nib, like a Mont Blanc 149, you can't ink the pen in this bottle. I mean, you can kind of, but only as long as the ink is full. You either have to decant this into a different container to ink up the pen, or do some fancy trickery with an ink syringe or something like that. The bottles have this little lip on the edge that you can put a pen holder on it, but frankly, I've never seen the point of this. And it's a very narrow thing, so it'll work on some pens, but it doesn't really work all that well on other pens. It's just, I don't know. I don't care for these bottles. I don't think they're very attractive. They're not very utilitarian. So overall, a little disappointed in these bottles. But the ink inside the bottle, I actually like a fair bit. More than I was expecting to like in any case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and write the name of the ink with several different pens so you can see how it works. Some of the pens I've inked, some of them I've dipped. And then I will walk you through the rest of my tests so you can see kind of how it performed on different kinds of paper, that sort of thing. So we will begin by starting with a dip pen that has a fine nib on it. This is a Ranga pen. This is an Indian-made ebonite pen. And the ink is J. Herbin EU. I'm going to misspell that almost every time. Pervenche. And that's fine. Then, for medium, we are using a Lamy Vista, which is J. Herbin Bleu Pervenche. And if I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize. I have not studied French, so that's my best approximation of the pronunciation. Then we've got J. Herbin Bleu Pervenche in bold. Next, we have a 1.1 millimeter stub, and this is, oh, excuse me. And then finally, just have to swap them out on my VAC 700 here. And dip it, we have a 1.5 millimeter stub. Yep. And then, since I consider medium to be pretty much the perfect nib width for fountain pens, just across the board, let me just do a quick brown fox here in medium. Okay. So there you can see on the ink is actually a very interesting color. It's kind of a deep azure, or almost a cerulean, not quite a cerulean blue. There are little tiny hints of green in here, but not terribly. There's also an interesting red sheen, which you won't be able to see very well on the video. It's a dark red sheen. It's not super pronounced. It's not the sheeniest of inks I've ever seen, but interesting color, decent shading, uh, and in a wet pen, I actually like the depth of the color on this ink quite a bit. This appears to be one of the more saturated J. Herbin inks I've ever used before. With the full understanding, I haven't used a lot of their inks. So that's how it looks writing. In terms of other inks that are similar to this, and maybe I'll do this. I haven't done this yet, but maybe I'll do a comparisons photo on the website, the Pen Habit website. Inks that might be considered comparable. Perhaps we're looking at a Roshizuku um, Amairo or Konpeki. The Mont Blanc Dandy Turquoise would probably be the Honoré de Balzac Dandy Turquoise. Um, Perhaps the Kaweco Turquoise as well. So this is kind of a turquoisey color, but I see turquoise as just a little bit more green. There's very little green in this ink. It's mostly just blue, sky blue. Um, Darker than my shirt, actually. Okay, so let's set this aside and now start talking through some of the tests that I have done. So this is the Rhodia paper test, and Rhodia is my baseline here. So you can see there's some fairly decent shading here. It's pass 1, pass 2, pass 3, and the nice color swatch. And then here are some various writings. You can see when the pen is wet, it's really quite a nice deep blue color here. Dry pens tend to run a little on the light side, but you get much more shading on a dry pen than you do on a wet pen. I used a flex pen here, got some, a little bit of movement. You can see it gets really, really dark when it gets wet, and then a pilot parallel here. And then some writing samples down here. I'll have photos of all of these on the Pen Habit website. So if you want to see any of these in more close-up detail, just head over to penhabit.com. Check the link in the description below to see all of the photos for this. Let's talk dry times. So this ink does not dry very well on Rhodia paper. It actually tends to, even at 30 seconds, it was still partially wet. So those are fairly long dry times. And it's my understanding that's fairly unusual for J. Herbin inks. Again, I don't have a lot of experience with them, but they generally don't tend to run this long. So this was done in a medium pen, and I would consider the pen that I did it in a very moderate pen. It's the Lamy Vista that I used earlier. In terms of some of the water tests or, chemical tests, it's not very water resistant at all. The rub test really moved the ink around. The one that surprised me, though, was the bleach test. It just wiped this ink clear. So all I do is spray pure bleach on the paper and let it sit for 10 or 15 seconds and daub it up with a paper towel. And so if you need to clean out your pen, if you've got a little bit of a staining or color left behind on this, go ahead and try bleach. Try a 10% bleach and water solution, or a water solution with 10% bleach, and that should take care of it because it just wiped it right off the paper as though it had never been there. Okay, so that's Rhodia paper. It behaves well. There's very little bleed. I only got bleed hints of it, very tiny hints of it down here when I did the flex writing, you can see. I like the color a lot. I gave that a 7. No feathering to speak of. Good flow. Not very much ghosting. It had a lot more lubrication than the other J. Herbin inks I've tried. It felt a lot smoother with the ink flow. Nice saturation, but not too terribly high. So if you're in a drier pen, it's still going to look a little unsaturated. Good shading, and on the Rhodia dot pad, only moderate sheen, and that's really only on super wet writing. So let's talk then about my favorite paper, the Tomoe River paper. So Tomoe River, as I've mentioned, 52 GSM paper, very thin, very fountain pen friendly, and probably the best paper you can use if you want to see an ink's sheen. So same sort of thing here. We've got all the different pens. The color is actually very similar between the white paper and the cream paper. So I don't see a big difference on cream colored paper in terms of the way the color looks. With some inks, you do notice a fairly significant difference. You can see slightly more sheen down here, especially on the wetter writing, or up here, that the word pen. And I'll try to have a close up of some of the sheen on the Tomoe River. The dry times here were equally pretty poor. It actually seemed to dry just a touch faster here. It wasn't quite as wet at 30 seconds as it was on the Rhodia paper, but Tomoe River paper is so thin, it's completely anti-absorbent. So, you're always going to have slower dry times on Tomoe River. Okay, looking at the radar chart for the Tomoe River, no bleed to speak of. Nice color appeal. I put it a little bit higher here, one number higher than on the Rhodia paper. Although, like I said, it's a very, very minor difference. I don't really notice much of a difference between those two papers. No feathering to speak of. Good flow. Very little ghosting, even on Tomoe River, which can be a little bit easier for ghosting because the paper is so thin. Lubrication feels a little bit higher on this paper, but that may have more to do with the fact that the paper is smoother than the Rhodia paper. Good saturation, good shading, and slightly better sheen than on the Rhodia. And then finally, let us look at some of the cheap stuff. So this is multi-purpose 20-pound Staples paper, 75 GSM Staples multi-purpose paper. It's not the specialty laser paper, which is surprisingly better for fountain pen ink than inkjet paper. So in general, on this paper, the ink is less interesting, and that's pretty common for cheap paper. Cheap paper doesn't allow the ink to shade as much, doesn't allow the ink to sheen as much because it gets absorbed right into the paper. But so you can see here, there's very little differentiation between some of the wetter and drier. The bold has a little bit slightly darker, as does the 1.5 millimeter stub have a slight bit darker quality, but it's very minor. You can see only hints of shading right here, but overall, it's not particularly interesting to look at. Still a nice color, but you don't get much of that depth or shading or sheen that you would get otherwise. Where the ink really shines on cheap paper is on the dry times. So it's still kind of wet at 1 second, and it's basically dry at 2 seconds. By 5 seconds, it's completely dry. And that was surprising to me. I was expecting, because there were such slow dry times on the other paper, I was expecting this to work pretty poorly, and have longer dry times. But good dry times if you use inexpensive paper. There is a fair bit of bleed, so I'll turn this over so you can see there's a fair bit of bleed here on the paper, on the cheap paper. So that didn't get a great score on the radar chart. Color appeal still quite high. There is a hint of feathering on the cheap paper, but it's not as bad as it could be. I was actually kind of surprised it wasn't worse, especially on some of the wetter stuff like the broad nib. There's minor feathering, but it's really not very bad. It felt a little less flowy this time, just because the paper absorbed the ink right away very quickly. Very little ghosting, or very high ghosting rather is what I meant. Part of that has to do with the fact that there's so much bleed. But yeah, there's a fair bit of ghosting on this paper. In terms of lubrication, a little less lubricated, but then the paper's a little less smooth. Saturation, a little bit lower. Again, I think it has a lot to do with the absorbency of the paper, and less shading. there's basically no sheen to speak of, which is not terribly surprising. And so that is this ink. So overall, thoughts on the J. Herbin ink, Bleu Pervenche. I like it. I like it more than I thought I was going to, based on my experiences with other J. Herbin inks, which I haven't really loved. You know, as I mentioned, I dislike these bottles a fair bit. I would rather have a narrower, taller bottle. I know they're more prone to tipping over, but it's also a lot easier to fill the jar or to fill your pen from the bottle. And they're utilitarian in a way, but they're not very attractive. So, you know, but then again, the ink's not terribly expensive. This is a 30 milliliter bottle, I believe. And, you know, if I had to give this ink a score from 1 to 10, I'd probably give it a 7. It's good. There are inks I like more, but it could certainly be a lot worse. This is an ink I would actually, if I had to use cheap paper often, and I don't, I would probably use this ink. But if you need it to be waterproof or permanent, this is not even an option for you because it will wash right off the paper. So I hope you've enjoyed this review of J. Herbin Bleu Pervenche. Go ahead and head over to penhabit.com. The link to this review is down in the video description, and you can see all the photos I took of the various paper tests and the close-ups, so you can see some of the sheen and shading and things like that. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down in the comment section below. Check out all the social media links also in the description. Like and subscribe, as always. And if you have any questions, you can, as I mentioned, put them in the comments or email me at penhabit@gmail.com. So thank you very much for watching, and we will see you here next time on The Pen Habit. Bye.